This is the T-Motor Pacer 2505 motor. And this video is not so much about this specific motor as it is about how to evaluate a motor like this. 2505, that's not a very common size. So is it better? Is it worse? Or how is it going to be different from the motors that maybe we're a little bit more familiar with, like 2306? In this video, I'm going to show you how I would approach this problem by comparing several motors with uncommon sizes with their more common counterparts. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. The first thing I do when I'm asked to evaluate a motor that I'm maybe not so familiar with is I think about the intended application of that motor, and I think about other similar, more common motors that I am familiar with. So a 2505 motor, let's just look and see if we can get a sense of approximately what it might be intended for. And frankly, we're not hearing much from this page. Instead, let's go to the manufacturer's webpage for the motor, because usually the manufacturer's webpage will have a little bit more information maybe than a store listing would. And if we scroll down here, we're going to start by seeing just a lot of marketing stuff that may give us a sense of like whether it's a freestyle motor or a racing motor, but things like silky smoothness, precise control. Or if we go down to the bottom of the page, we've got application scenarios, dense grove, low building, open parking lot. That's all marketing nonsense. I don't put much stake in it at all. If we go to specifications, we have got thrust-in information for the motor. So this also tells us what kind of props the manufacturer might think would be good for this motor. 70/40, so they seem to be testing it on 6-inch, 7-inch, and 51/43 5-inch props. The single most important spec when evaluating a motor's performance, in my opinion, is the stator volume. That's not all you need to know in order to know how the motor will perform, but if you don't know the stator volume, I don't think you can really start analyzing anything else about the motor. So we're going to pull up this cylinder volume calculator, and we're going to put the radius, which is going to be, this is a 2505, so 25 millimeters is the diameter. The radius is going to be half that, so it's going to be 12.5 millimeters, and the height is 5 millimeters. And that is going to give us a volume of 2454 cubic millimeters. So let's say that we're considering this motor for use on a 5-inch freestyle quad. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to pick a typical 5-inch freestyle motor, and we're going to compare its stator volume. So if we were to pick a 2207 motor, that would be 11 millimeter radius and 7 millimeter height, and we would get a stator volume of 2660 cubic millimeters. Now, the reason that stator volume is so important is that what a motor fundamentally does is generate torque. Torque is rotational force, and a motor generates rotational force. On a quadcopter, that rotational force is used to spin a propeller, and it is used to keep the propeller spinning at a certain RPM, and it is used to accelerate the propeller when we try to make the propeller go faster. The more torque a motor generates, the more responsive the motor is going to be. In other words, the faster it will change speed when we try and make it speed up. And that's important because on quadcopters and multirotors, responsive motors are incredibly important to having it fly well. And the more torque a motor generates, the higher the maximum RPM that the motor can generate will be. The faster it'll be able to spin the prop at the top end. And of those two things, responsiveness is probably more important than top-end speed, but if you're trying to do max speed runs, top-end speed is also going to be relevant. So why don't we just get motors with the biggest volume possible? Obviously, because of weight. We're going to think about weight a little bit later in the video. We're going to start with motor volume. Now, some of you aren't going to believe me when I say that torque depends on stator volume, and I'm taking that straight from the man himself, Chris Rosser. He's got a video, I'll link it down in the video description, where he derives this equation. The takeaway is that there are other things that affect the torque that a motor can generate, but for the motors that we're using, they're basically all the same, so the stator volume is the only thing that really differentiates the motors. So we've got a 2454 cubic millimeter motor compared to a 2660 cubic millimeter, technically 661 cubic millimeter motor, and that means it is about 92% the size, or about 8% smaller. And that's the first meaningful result that we've derived in this video. 2505 motor is about 8% smaller than a typical 2207 motor, and a 2306 is similar in volume, is a smaller motor, and therefore it's going to generate less torque. But whether that reduction in torque is actually going to matter to you depends a lot on how you're intending to use this motor. Because if you've got a lighter weight quadcopter, then your motor can generate higher RPMs with less torque. And if you've got a lower pitch prop, then your motor can accelerate it easier with less torque. So you might start to say that this motor is better suited for a lighter 5-inch quadcopter running a lower pitch, lighter weight prop, or someone who doesn't care as much about responsiveness and top end speed and is willing to give that stuff up, such as maybe someone who's more focused on cruising than on snappy freestyle flying. What about the shape of the motor? Shouldn't that come into play? It does, but not necessarily in the way that most people think. There's a common misconception that wider motors generate more torque and narrower motors generate more RPM, and that's just not true. It just isn't true. We have experimental and theoretical data to bear that out. The motor volume is what controls the torque. That's it. But the motor shape does have an effect, and there's two main effects. Number one is that wider motors have a larger moment of inertia because the mass of the motor is further away from the rotational axis. And that means that it takes more torque, more energy to change their speed. In other words, wider, flatter motors are less responsive than taller, narrower motors of the same volume, even though they generate the same torque because they have the same volume. And that relationship is really significant. Going back to Chris Rosser's video here, he demonstrates that there is a cubic dependence on the radius of the bell. The moment of inertia increases as the cube of the radius. So a small increase in radius gives a much bigger decrease in the responsiveness of the motor. The advantage of a wider motor is that it has a much larger surface area exposed to airflow going through the motor. And that means it's going to stay cooler. And that's not just about, like, I don't want to smoke my motors. As a motor heats up, it loses the ability to generate magnetic flux, and therefore it loses the ability to generate torque. In other words, a hotter motor will be less powerful than a cooler motor of the exact same specification. So in a situation where heat buildup is limiting the performance of the motor, shifting from a taller, narrower motor to a wider, flatter motor will give you more power. But in a situation where there is not significant heat buildup and there is enough cooling of the motors, you'll be better off with a narrower, taller motor that will have a lower moment of inertia and more responsiveness. Again, going back to Chris Rosser's amazing video, we have some guidelines here about a ratio between diameter and height. And again, that is diameter, which is the typically used spec, not radius. The ratio of diameter to height, which gives us some guidelines as to when the motor might be too tall or and might have heat buildup problem. And fortunately, the math is really easy to do for this 2505. We have approximately a 5-to-1 ratio. 25 divided by 5 is 1. 5-to-1 ratio of diameter to height. So where does this 5-to-1 ratio lie in Chris Rosser's recommendations? He says that a ratio of less than 3-to-1 can lead to hot motors, and a ratio of more than 6-to-1 is probably bad news. So we are well away from this 3-to-1 ratio. The 5-to-1 ratio means we probably have more than adequate cooling, and we're getting close to that 6-to-1 ratio that he says is bad news. Why is it bad news? Because a wide and flat motor, the flatter the motor is, the smaller the magnets are going to be. And eventually you just don't have enough mating surface between the magnet and the stator, and you just can't make power effectively. So let's recap what we know about this motor so far. It's about 8% smaller than a typical 2306 or 2207 freestyle motor, so it makes about 8% less thrust. It has a height to width ratio of about 5-to-1, when you compare that to a 2306, which is closer to about 4 to 1, or a 2207, which is closer to about 3 to 1, then it is a wider, flatter motor, which is going to have better cooling, but we kind of don't need the better cooling anyway, so we're just giving up something for nothing. Kind of starting to seem like there isn't a point to this motor. However, we haven't looked at the weight yet. The motor comes in at 31.25 grams, including the cable. And if you compare that to a typical 2306 or 2207, they usually come in closer to, let's say, 33 grams. Yes, I know there are exceptions, like somehow Heads Up FPV bent physics to make the 533 2207 motor come in at 28.4 grams. Fantastic. But this motor is about 8% lighter than a typical motor in that class. So what we really seem to be doing here is getting a motor that's lighter, giving up a little power, getting a little extra cooling to make up for the fact that the smaller motor is going to have to work harder to spin the prop. And maybe for some people, that's going to be actually worth it. Let's do another comparison, this time between the Brother Hobby 2004 and the FPV Cycle 21mm motor, just to kind of drive these points home. I'm not going to go into all the details again, we're just going to run through the steps. But before we do that, if you've learned something in this video, would you mind going down and hitting the like button? It tells YouTube that this is a video that more people should see and really helps out the channel. I sure do appreciate it. Okay, let's compare these motors. The volume of the two motors is as shown here, and if we pull in the calculator, we can compare that as a percent, 1732 divided by 1257. We can see that the 21mm motor is way bigger, 38% bigger than its little, oh, just gone up by 1mm would make you think. And the reason for that is that on a wider motor, adding a millimeter of height adds a lot of volume. So we have a significantly bigger and more powerful motor here. These guys aren't even in the same sort of class. What about weight? We've got 14.9 grams with short wires for the 2004 and 14.6 grams with short wires for the 2104. We don't know the exact wire length that they're both referring to, but they're pretty close to the same weight. And this is something that Kebab is somehow able to do. He makes these larger, more powerful motors, but somehow manages to keep the weight down. In other words, it sure seems like there is almost no downside to this 21mm motor, at least in terms of its stator size and volume. If we were to choose a similar KV, we would expect to just get better top-end power, better responsiveness, better performance overall out of the 21mm motor compared to the 2004. The trade-off is going to be that the taller 2104 motor is going to have just a little bit worse cooling. And the ultimate question that we have to go back to when considering these things is, do we need the additional torque that that larger motor volume is going to give us? Go back to the concept of torque reserve. Does a 2004 motor typically have enough torque reserve, or is it kind of over-propped and struggling with the amount of torque and therefore not as responsive as we'd like it to be? And I think if we think about flying a 2004 motor on a 5-inch prop, like an Umagod 250, I think that most people would agree that a 2004 motor does not have sufficient torque reserve to get as much responsiveness as we would usually like. It's usually working a little too hard, and we could use a little bit bigger motor, assuming we can go above 250 grams. That's why he uses this undersized motor, because he needs to stay under that weight target. But if you're using a 5-inch prop, most people would say even that a 21mm motor is a little bit too small, and you would benefit from something like a 23mm motor at a minimum. On the other hand, if we're thinking about something like a Cinewhoop, those smaller props used on a Cinewhoop might be just fine on a 2004 motor. It might have plenty of torque reserve, and therefore going to this larger 2104 motor might give us additional torque reserve that we don't need with worse cooling, and therefore the 2004 might be the better choice. As I'm talking through this, I got to acknowledge that a whole lot of this depends on having an understanding of how motors are performing and whether they have sufficient volume for the prop and the weight. And unfortunately, there just aren't any like guidelines. This prop needs this stator volume. I take that back. Yes, there is such a reference. I just remembered this spreadsheet, which was made by Bob Ruge, Kebab FPV, and shared with me. And one of the key pieces of information it has is suggested prop sizes for certain motor sizes. So for example, if we home in here on the 4-inch, 5-inch category, we can see, so these green rectangles are what he thinks to be an optimum ratio of surface area to volume, basically the shape of the motor, tall versus wide. And we can see here that, for example, a 2203 is a little bit big for a 4-inch, right? But a little bit small for a 5-inch prop. But a 2203 and a 2204 has what he considers to be the optimal shape, the optimal surface area versus volume. Whereas a 2004, we can see that he considers it to be pretty undersized for a 5-inch and a little bit too wide and not tall enough. Now, that's just his opinion. Obviously, a lot of people use 2004 on a lightweight 5-inch for various reasons, but it is a way to sort of get you in the ballpark of, for the prop size that you're looking for, what might be a somewhat appropriate prop size. If somebody said, hey, I'm going to run a 2806.5 motor on a 5-inch prop, you could say, that's probably too big of a motor. It probably has way more torque than we really need and is going to be heavier than we need it to be. See how that works? I'll put a link to this down in the video description if you want to download it. Now, at this point, what you're probably thinking is, Bardwell, there's a whole lot of characteristics you think about when you're shopping for a motor that you're overlooking here. And yeah, I do confess I'm focusing just on the size and shape. But one of the questions that you might be having right now is, if you go to that larger motor, will you get shorter flight time because it's going to suck your battery down more? And it turns out that's a hard question to answer, because if a motor is undersized, it will draw extra current and make less power. And in that case, going to a larger motor will give you more efficiency and longer flight time. But if a motor is oversized, then it'll waste power and you'll get shorter flight time. I did an interview with Chris Rosser, Ryan Harrell, and Bob Ruge, Kebab FPV. We took 2 hours of my normal live stream slot and had one of the most stimulating conversations about motors that I have ever had. If you missed it when it first came out, I'm going to put a card on screen. I highly recommend, if you made it all the way through this video, you are going to love that video. Definitely check it out. If you value the content that I'm making here, would you also consider joining my Patreon for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned it? It's totally up to you. You can support me. If today's the day that I've earned it, click that link and go sign up. If I haven't earned it yet, I'm going to keep making content. You keep watching the content, and hopefully that day will come. Happy flying.